The pale stone fortress didn't look like a school. Then again, an academy for mercenaries wouldn't, would it? The lessons taught to children don't have a place here, behind the battlements. The students at this school have already learned what they could from the world as a youth. They came here to, what? Learn to kill people? Tisila stood inside the open gateway, musing to herself as her tired emerald eyes swept their way across the stout, unassuming stone face of the Merigard Academy. It was clearly a fortress built from necessity, once. Arrow-slit windows and prominent matriculations promised a powerful threat to any sieging armory, once upon a time. Now, the warm summer breeze brought with it the smell of sweat and the sea, the sounds of training and laughter. In the courtyard, a handful of hopefuls stood, with wooden weapons, as a tower of a man moved amongst them, declaring orders and criticisms, with a sharp voice that sang of exotic origin. Tisila noticed the man was not human. The blue hue and the tattoos adorning his skin marked him as a Goliath, the result of breeding between humans and stone giants millennia ago. The Goliath swatted at a pupil with a short prop, declaring something about the shorter man's stance was incorrect, and he should realize what a fool he'd been. The Goliath turned and strode toward another student, although his gaze caught Tisila's eye for a moment. He winked before continuing his work amongst his pupils. The whole moment had taken just that, a moment. Tisila shook her head, turning her attention back to the proud double doors of the castle, suddenly very self-aware. Every one of those students could see her, but they were far too busy with their own instructions to notice her. Only the Goliath had paid her any attention, right? She frowned, suddenly feeling a fool for standing on the cobbled approach for so long, and strode up to the double doors. As she pushed them open, cool air from the fortress's interior washed over her, pushing her long black hair behind her in a plume. She blinked, surprised by the blast, her eyes not yet accustomed to the darker interior. It only took a moment to adjust, and as she stepped inside, the heavy oaken doors closed with a resounding, final boom. The room was decorated with paintings and banners along wooden carved walls, and a cool stone floor of dark gray shale led to a broad redwood desk. Behind the desk, a dwarf sat. She? Tisila hadn't met many dwarves. The beard was remarkably well kept, so it could have been either. Scratched away at a parchment with a fine fountain pen, only stopping to add ink to it from a small bottle. The dwarf glanced up during a pause to notice Tisila. "Hello? Be right with you." Clearly a male by the voice. His melodic accent, tinged with harmony despite narrow in range, reminded her of the northerly Kao, of elves, and of the cold. Tisila stepped forward, her eyes taking in the paintings of portraits lining the walls, various individuals of all sorts of races looking down at her. She spotted one portrait displaying the same Goliath she had spotted outside. Bright gray eyes beneath a bald head, his blue face festooned with a fine filigree of tattoos, decorating his cheeks to his chin. It is rumored that the tattoos a Goliath wears are very important. They define who that Goliath hoped to be. Their aspirations and goals, chosen at a young age and molded over time, were worn clearly on their skin. It was a sort of honesty to oneself that Tisila could appreciate, though she had known none personally. While tattoos might have been important to any and all who chose to wear them, for Goliaths, it was paramount, a part of who they were. A Goliath without tattoos, well, they were seen as deceivers. Outcasts or outlaws, surely folk that did not want anyone to know what they were truly about. This Goliath, in the painting, however, did not look at all like a trickster of any sort. He was smiling, broadly, the corners of his eyes crinkling. Beneath the portrait, Tisila noticed the placard marking it. Ilrad Vilnaradi, Master of Fighters. She made a mental note, and began to study the other portraits when the dwarf spoke once more. Sorry about that. Welcome to the Merigard Academy. How can I help? He had set his pen down, and was giving Tisila his full attention. With a mental quelling of anxiety, Tisila stepped up to the desk. This close, she could see the ornaments woven into the dwarf's beard. Symmetrical bands of iron and copper, perfect in their placement within his dark brown hair to frame his face. She swallowed nervously. My name is Tisila Lothlane, and I'm here to enroll. Captain Black said he'd send word. The dwarf's brow furrowed, and he pulled a small, thin pair of spectacles from a drawer as he began sifting through more and more parchment. After a moment, he drew one from the pile with a flick of his wrist. Yes, he says you'd been causing some trouble. The dwarf looked up over his spectacles at Tisila. I suspect you'll not be causing any issues here. Tisila shook her head, doing her best to forget the events of that particular night. It was either the Merigard or... Captain Black hadn't been specific. The dwarf nodded. Well, proper introductions then. I'm Persh. Hal Persh to me, folks, and you can consider me the Merigard's mercenary handler. I take the jobs, I assign them, and I assign the teams. He frowns as he looks at the other side of the parchment, and then looks down at Tisila once more. Enroll. You're here as a student, then? Tisila nodded. After a pause, perhaps having expected more, Persh continued. You have the fee. 100 gold for a year of training in the exams. Tisila reached for the pouch of coin Captain Black had given her. Of the haul she had stolen, it was merely a pittance, but such were the costs of getting caught. She lifted it up and handed it to Persh. Persh took the small leather bag between 3 fingers, upending it as the coins rolled out onto his desk. He flattened them with his palm. The sound of scratching as he counted filled the ears, until finally he looked up. 10 platinum will do the trick. Right. Sign here. He produced a ledger and offered a quill. Tisila took the quill in hand and looked down at the ledger. The quill was specifically not the fine pen the dwarf had been using before. Perhaps he was just careful with it, she mused. She had considered a fake name, a new alias to live under, to help escape those who knew her. But she wrote Tisila Lothlane anyway, with a sheepish purse of her lips. As Persh took the implements back, he gestured to his right. Right. You'll head down that hallway and take the first door on your right. There you'll select your course of training. You can talk to Maxwell about the courses if you like. Behind me, you can go through either archway to reach the mess hall. That's where you'll be taking your meals. After you select your course, you'll be shown to your training room and then to your dormitory. Persh took his spectacles off, wiping them before returning them to his drawer. He set his elbows onto the desk once more, giving Tisila a knowing look. You're young, Tisila. Well, I think you are. It's impossible to tell with those. Anyway, you've been through some trouble. I can see it written on your face. As the day so far had been happening to Tisila, rather than her having any real effect on how it went, it was no surprise to her he might point it out. But she began to smooth her features into those of a less weary sort. She shook her head, but Persh continued. Take what you can learn here. You've got a year of paid for food and board. You can squander it till you get back out there, back to stealing or what have you. Or, he smiled, you apply yourself. You learn some useful tricks. You get recruited to work for us. You'll get steady pay and more food and board, long as you want. He leaned back, the chair he was seated upon creaking slightly. Welcome to the Marigold Mercenary Academy. Tisila looked at the dwarf, mouth shut, no words finding their way out. She looked around at the portraits on the wall, at the man seated in front of her, and at the desk, which was covered in parchment that, to her quick eye, looked like requests for aid or calls to arms. She didn't say a word, uncertain how to respond to the dwarf's assumptions. Maybe he'd guessed right about her plans, but that didn't make it right that he'd throw them in her face. As Tisila walked beyond the desk, shaking the right-hand hallway as instructed, she sighed. He hadn't thrown it in my face. This was a new start, and I should take things as they come, one step at a time. That's not the same as lowering my guard. The door to the right was a simple one, with a brass knob and a placard marking its selections. Tisila stared at the knob for several moments, and looked up at the dwarf receptionist. Persh was back to his paperwork, pen scratching, where she could hear the heavy creak of the double doors open. Light from outside spilled in, illuminating Persh, and was accompanied by a mixture of cheerful voices laughing and jeering at each other. Persh didn't look up, but Tisila caught sight of a pale green hand slapping a brown document onto the desk. An unfamiliar deep voice with a warmth of humor to it spoke. Job's done, boss, no problem. Persh glanced up, lifting the corner of the document to show it was a file containing other parchment. Tisila couldn't read them from here. Her view was then blocked as the tall, broad form of a man with black hair and green skin leaned on the desk, his back to her, wearing thick chain armor. A bow as tall as he was slung over his back, and before Tisila risked being spotted by any other newcomers in the lobby, she turned the knob and pushed into the room. The door opened silently. The room was small compared to the lobby, and it was dominated by an enormous table. The entire far wall was covered by this table, which had been covered in all sorts of weapons. All of them looked new. Shining, wickedly sharp daggers and swords, a two-handed axe that reflected lantern light and the hammer marks on the blade, finely hewn bows, both large and small. A moment of apprehension washed through Tisila, convinced she had entered the wrong room. The hesitation eased when she noticed each set of weapons had small labels beneath them, with an illustration that matched the portraits she had seen in the lobby. Her shoulders relaxed, and she gently closed the door behind her with her back. Do I take them? Why are there so many? Hello. Good morning. A male voice emerged from a corner. Tisila nearly yelped in surprise, so unseen had this man been, and when she whipped toward him, her hand reached for the blackjack she kept in her belt. Had kept in her belt, until she'd been caught. A human man, his feet kicked up onto a small podium as he leaned back in a wooden chair, looked at Tisila with sharp, walnut eyes. He wore dark brown leathers and linens, the sort of clothes one can hide things in. His hair was short, the brown of his armor, dappled with hints of gray and trailed across his face in an unkempt shadow of a beard and a mustache. He waited for her to reply as she tried to gather herself. Eventually, she did. Good morning. She searched for a defense, a reason she was in the room with countless, brilliantly made weapons and armaments. Eventually, she pointed to the door. Persh told me to come in here, to enroll. The man smiled, and he thumped the chair down to sit upright. Ah, a new recruit. Paid up, are you? His voice was low, warm and burnished with the accents of a native Aurelian. He leaned forward and took a small ledger from the podium.
Go on then. Have a look at the table, select your course of training. You'll be in it for a year, and after such, you'll have a chance to pass your class exams.
Tisila blinked and looked towards the table again. Choose a weapon? Do I keep it? The man smirked.
You'd better. It'll be your main weapon you use while you're here, till you get something better. The other gear play the course as well. Nothing magical here, of course, but Seka did a fine job crafting our equipment.
Seka. So many names to remember, and I'd only learned 3 so far. Tisila looked back at the man. And if I don't pass? What then?
Well, your fee of 100 gold pieces covers you for a year. A year of food, training, shelter, equipment. You fail your exam, you can take another year of training and try again, assuming you find the coin.
He shrugged.
If you want a life here, though, you gotta pass your exam. At least your first one. None say you can't try another trade once you're established.
Feeling dazed at all the information, Tisila said nothing further, approaching the table instead. What had originally struck her as a mess of objects was, instead, clearly organized. There were just so many. Small, carefully written placards were set before sets of equipment. The first set was labeled Tauren Row, Barbarian Course, and far above it was an open leather rucksack. Neatly arranged in front of it were a pair of hand axes, their hafts a pale, smooth wood, and their heads were wickedly sharp, the blades reaching down as though they were meant to hook an enemy's weapon. Near that, a sheaf of javelins, each long and slender and sturdy, and while they were long, they paled in comparison to the largest weapon displayed here, a great axe. Reaching from the near edge of the table to the wall, the wooden haft was carved to fit hands well along its length, and the head was black forged steel. It was an intimidating weapon, the likes of which Tisila had only seen rarely. Her inspection was paused when her eyes passed over a breastplate, a mirror, polished chest piece, that reflected her visage back. She looked so tired, warped from the shape of the armor, but the image was clear enough. Her long black hair was loose and wild, tangled around her pointed ears and forehead as though she hadn't tended to it for months. The weariness drew the color from her eyes, draining them from the emerald green she knew to a muddy shadow of it in the lantern light. Her tanned skin was marked with soil from the road. Dust and streaks of black soot from campfires decorated her cheeks and eyebrows. Her lips were cracked from the wind, and a small scab at the corner of her mouth reminded her. The shock of light and pain rattled Tisila to the core. The wooden of the floor rose to meet her cheekbone, her arm slamming down into it to catch her fall. It was much too late, and as her vision sparked to recover, she caught sight of the thick leather boots running, pounding toward her, lifting off the ground, crushing into her abdomen as they drove their boot into her. Tisila coughed out, a mouthful of blood that had not been there a moment ago. The taste of iron was not unfamiliar, but this was more than ever before.
"The other doors!"
A distant shout.
"I've got this one!"
The voice from above her declared. The boot shoved Tisila by the shoulder until she was flat on her back. The light from the lantern was blinding, but around it she could see the shadow of a man in guard's raiment, looking down at her. He opened his mouth, she could tell by the outline of his chin. He didn't say anything, or rather, Tisila couldn't hear him. She realized nothing made any sound anymore, as the man turned his head to respond to someone.
"Are you all right?"
the man asked, a hint of concern ringing in his voice. It wasn't the same voice, but it was familiar, as if she had just heard it, warm and burnished, with an accent and a quality that was used to hushed whispers. Tisila shook her head. She didn't remember that. Shaken from the memory, she blinked to clear the welling anxiety and fear that she had felt at the time. A hand set upon her shoulder, and she turned from the table of armaments, the selections room, returning to her consciousness.
"What is it, girl?"
the dark-haired man asked.
"You started breathing wrong. Heavy." "It's all right. You can change your choice before it's too late. after a month or so.
Tisila shook her head, attempting to clear the fog of the potent memory. She rubbed at her face, her palms pressing hard into her eyes until stars appeared on her periphery. She opened them to look straight towards the man. I'm sorry. I just remembered something I didn't like. The man nodded and eased his hand from her shoulder.
All right, well, take your time, and I'll be right there if you need me. I'm Maxwell.
He gave her a smile, one that was colored with pity, before he turned and sat back down in his corner. Tisila watched as he sat down, wary until Maxwell kicked his feet up once more, and she turned back to the table of weapons and armor. She knew what a barbarian was, an emotional skirmisher who could weather the most powerful blows from even the greatest monsters by calling upon reserves of primal, natural, or even magically enhanced rage. She also knew she was not of the fortitude, nor the mentality to be a barbarian. She had always solved her problems by finding another angle, or perhaps avoiding those that might have started an issue in the first place. It wasn't a perfect solution, and clearly it did not always work. She was here because of that. She pursed her lips as the thoughts crossed her mind before proceeding down the table to the next entry. Tally Soul Singer, Bard Course, was written beneath an intricate display of equipment. A smaller pack, the one a sort might wear over a shoulder, was open, revealing parchment, pen, makeup, perfumes, all of which was nestled beneath a gleaming, polished longsword. The blade was sharp. Tisila could see that just from the light, but it looked too long for her purposes. She didn't want a weapon that might hook into a wall or clatter on the floor when she moved. Her eyes then drifted up to a finely made viola, a darkly stained wooden instrument that smelled of lacquer. It shined in the lantern light of the room, and Tisila almost snorted.
What good would music do for a mercenary?
Of course, she had heard of magic performed at the hands of musicians, but she hadn't seen it. The idea of it was amusing, and she quietly shook her head. Mostly, it was to herself, although she was suddenly acutely aware of the man watching her as she examined the courses. Her ears reddened at the potential remarks the man might make, questioning her laugh, ridiculing her for her thoughts. Of course, none came, and Tisila then paused at the next entry. Niall Barlow, Bloodhunter Course. Above the placard, most noticeably, was a potion. It was a tall vial, flat on the bottom as to stand freely upon the table, with a black cork. Within, a swirling, fogged liquid that hinted of brown and red in the light reminded Tisila of rust. Above it, a selection of weapons that looked fit for a soldier littered the table. A short sword the length of Tisila's forearm, yet easily the width of her hand, was the most prominent. Beyond that, crossbows, caltrops, throwing knives, and short axes were atop a pile of rope and climbing equipment. It looked like a pack one might use to explore a mountain, Tisila mused, but she tinily turned to Maxwell. What's a bloodhunter? She asked quietly. She wasn't sure she had said it loud enough for him to hear, but he replied regardless.
Folk who drink magical blood of monsters to sense them. Track them down. Hence the name.
Maxwell was picking at his fingernails as he spoke, not looking up.
Woodsy folk, usually. Careful about them, though. I hear the concoction drives them mad.
Tisila blinked. So, if I wanted that to sense monsters, I'd drink this potion.
Aye.
Maxwell nodded, having set his hand down and looked up at her.
And if you survive it, you get magic you didn't have.
With a nod of thanks, Tisila turned back to the table. I think not that one. She bowed her head slightly when she heard Maxwell chuckle, her gaze still upon the table. She looked over the remaining settings, hoping one might fit her, if even a little. Varian Treat, Cleric Course. Folly Clearwater, Druid Course. Shrike Canderfell, Artificer's Course. With each More and more unique from the last, Tisila felt a little more lost and hopeless. Of course, a mercenary team wouldn't need her. A sneak. In a world where problems were destroyed by a magical blast, a crossbow bolt, or cleaving with an axe, she'd find no place here. Not for her. Maxwell White. Rogue, of course. The name gave Tisila a shock as she read it and turned to glance over her shoulder at Maxwell. He was inspecting the ledger. No. He looked like he was inspecting the ledger. Paying attention, Tisila noticed the corner of his lip quirked upward. His posture was too high to be comfortably reading. No, he was watching her, and he was careful not to look obvious about it. Tisila turned back to the table, a small smile of pride upon her lips, having figured a small thing about the man. Maxwell White. He must be the same man. Perhaps Captain Black had mentioned my talents in his letter. Tisila looked upon the implements of the rogue course. A long, fine woolen cloak in a dark blue hue was laid out. At a glance, Tisila could see a number of discreet pockets sewn into the garment, and below it was an entire bundle of throwing knives. Each was finely weighted, made by someone who knew how to throw a real throwing knife, and not the sort of scrap iron Tisila had learned to toss back home. A large leather pouch, dyed the same hue as the cloak, sat, fat as a lazy toad. Tisila hooked a finger into it and found a slew of useful tools. Ball bearings, fine silk cord, oil, a blackjack. Tisila pulled the small tool out of the pouch and felt the heft of it in her hand. It was a brilliant weapon. A finely molded piece of leather, filled with heavy lead shot. If you need a fella to fall asleep right quick, give the back of his head a quick knock with one of these, love. A familiar voice played through Tisila's memory. This blackjack was far nicer than the one she had been given, though. This one fit her hand as if it had been made for her, and was flat enough to hide against her wrist. She kept the blackjack in hand, fiddling it between her fingers as if it were a piece of home. She went back to looking at the supplies on the table, and her eyes went farther along the cloak. Above it was another rucksack, although this one was clearly made with silence in mind. Its leather was finely oiled, and the thing looked softer than a night's rest. With only a moment's hesitation, Tisila reached out and picked up the pack, shrugging it onto her shoulder, and her hand finding the dagger hidden within the strap. It was a stiletto, a long and slender dagger that would easily tease its way between the rings of chainmail. The blade was oiled and sharp, and softly gleamed the blues of fine steel. She slid it back into its sheath and turned to Maxwell. I'd like to be a rogue. He smiled, making a small scribble on the ledger before closing it with a thump. Well, what are you waiting for? He asked, sitting forward, a hand on his knee. Get your kit on. Tisila looked back at the table and then over her shoulder at the rucksack she carried. I take all of it. Maxwell made a rolling gesture with his hand as if to hurry her. Yeah, all of it. All the rogue equipment. Go on. You're going to need it. Sheepishly, Tisila set the rucksack on the table and pulled the cloak from it. Beneath it, several bound rolls of leather were tied, hidden beneath the cloak. Tisila looked back at Maxwell. He sighed. It's your armor. Well, one of them is. Come on, we're going to need to see which fits you. Maxwell stood up and stepped closer. Come on, get your clothes off so as we can sit you up. Tisila's eyes widened, her cheeks a scarlet red as she looked at Maxwell, about to open her mouth in protest. As she drew in the breath as if to yell at him, Maxwell raised a hand. Just to your undergarments. If you can fit it yourself, I'll wait outside. He chuckled, and Tisila fumed at him for it. I can fit it myself, Tisila snapped, the words sharper than they may have needed to be, but Maxwell nodded. He turned and left, closing the door behind him. Looking down at the rolled leather bundles on the table, Tisila cursed herself. I should have asked which was even close, she thought, as she began unwrapping the parcels. 30 minutes later, Tisila opened the door to see Maxwell leaning against the wall opposite, his arms folded and a short pipe gently wafting a sweet and fruity smoke into the air. He appraised her selection of armor with a raised eyebrow, and his lips raised in a small smile, before snuffing the pipe with the palm of his hand.
Well, close enough.
Maxwell waved with his hand to gesture her back into the room. As he followed, closing the door behind them, he began attending to Tisila's armor faster than she had thought possible. The armor was composed of wine-treated and hardened leather plates, reinforced with black iron studs that Tisila was quite sure would turn a blade. Small, overlapping sections made the joints easy to move in, and all of it was bound by sturdy leather straps that tied at her sides. Being a dark walnut in color, the armor looked as though it could easily blend into a shadow. And mostly, it fit well. Or so she had thought. As Maxwell moved around her, his deft fingers firmly drawing each leather strap as tight as it could, the studded armor pulled itself snugly against her frame. The sturdy plates of hide began to press uncomfortably into the bones of her hips, even somehow managing to squeeze into her ribcage on one side, but not the other. She weathered the storm without complaint as Maxwell adjusted the suit, until finally he stood up.
How does it feel?
He asked, folding his arms. Despite the various locations across her body that did not feel fine, Tisila said,
Fine.
Maxwell shook his head.
No armor's fine right off the shelf. Be serious, girl, or go somewhere else. Where is it uncomfortable?
After a sheepish blush, Tisila swallowed whatever it was that would hide the truth, and she began to point. Maxwell drew a length of chalk from his own belt pouch and began marking where she indicated, with more marks depending on just how uncomfortable it was. Finally, after all of it was finished, Maxwell nodded with a smile.
Right. Now, off with it. Saka will make the changes to it, and you'll have a proper set made for you.
He deftly began to undo all of the knots he had applied, his practiced fingers working so quickly Tisila worried the suit would fall to the floor before he was done. But it didn't. Maxwell stood, gesturing to the clothes she had left on the table.
Take that off, get dressed, and get the rest of your kit. I'll be in the hall.
Feeling as though she were an obedient child, Tisila waited for him to exit the room before she began to lift the armor off and over her head. She realized now how wrong she had been every time she had strapped on a piece of scrap back home. This had been snug, tighter than a glove. It made sense, really, that if she was to sneak about and hide, her armor had to be a second skin. She just haven't given it much thought before. The amount of equipment that was spread across the table for rogue courses was astonishing. Lockpicks, hearing horns, ropes, climbing pitons, shoe spikes, small bolts of black wool, yet all of it fit in the rucksack, smoothly and easily. She pulled the cloak on, sliding several of the throwing knives into the woolen pockets within, and stood. She felt dangerous. She had no less than 7 weapons at her disposal, all of which were within easy reach, and all of them were of real quality. The small, nimble shortbow she had found in the rucksack surprised her. It was very difficult to draw, as she had discovered, and knew she would need to practice with the thing before she gained any form of ease with it. I suppose I could use it as a springy club, she mused. She began to head towards the door and raised her eyebrows. The woolen cloak was silent. She carried more metal at this moment than she ever had in her life, and yet she was certain she could hide right next to a person. Her face split in a wide smile before she began to hop around the room. Her giddy excitement at the absence of rattling filled her with a hope that she hadn't felt in a long time. How many times had the tinkle of her gear gotten her nearly caught? Rubbing too close to a wall, the shape of her rusty old picks on the stone. Not anymore. After several minutes of dashing about and marveling at the quietness of her equipment, she opened the door. Maxwell was back to his old posture, holding up the wall with his pipe in his mouth. He looked up from it to Tisila, an approving nod tipping his head as he appraised her.
Nicely done. You even strapped it in right.
He stepped away from the wall, gesturing down the hall.
Let's show you to our training room, and then to quarters.
He stepped down the hall, assuming she would follow. The small smile that played at Tisila's lips grew as she stepped to follow Maxwell. 100 gold, and she already had the best tools she had ever had. She was going to get a proper set of armor, too. I could make off with it all, as soon as I have it, and who'd be the wiser? I could make money anywhere. People always leave their coin purses too far in the open for their own good, Tisila mused. With knives as proper as these, they wouldn't even feel me slice into their treasuries and help myself. Her thoughts were halted as Maxwell suddenly stopped and turned, opening a small wooden door to his right. He entered it, glancing back at Tisila with a raised eyebrow. She could see the door open to a set of stairs leading downwards, and so she followed, the stairwell dimly lit and dusty from the collected grit on the stone steps. The stairwell must have descended 2 stories, and it opened subtly into a large room. It was sparsely occupied. The only other person within was a tall, auburn-haired, half-elven woman. She was seated at a small table, lazily tossing daggers into a very heavily marked bullseye across the room. A few daggers were not on target. She turned to look as Maxwell and Tisila entered the room, her face splitting into a wide smile.
Talahai, meet Tisila. Tisila, this is Talahai. She went to a bard college.
The man strode across the room, entering another door. Talahai stopped throwing daggers to lean forward, regarding Tisila with bright eyes.
Hello!
She was cheery and genuinely seemed pleased to see Tisila.
You're a new one, then? You made the best choice there is, Maxwell's a fine bloke, Tizzy.
Her voice was rich and broguish thick and singing of a KO heritage. Somehow her and Persh's accent sounded as if they'd come from the same place, but different sides of it. Tisila blushed at the nickname that was immediately applied to her, but she didn't respond. Maxwell returned to the room with a handful of parchments.
Tal, don't you have work to do? A team to meet with? Anything?
With an exaggerated sigh, Talahai stood up with a false tantrum of motion.
Fine. I'll be seeing you round, though, Tizzy? I quite like the sound of that.
She nudged Tisila with her elbow, before sauntering out of the room, a tune humming. Tisila turned to Maxwell. My name is not Tizzy.
You'd best tell her that before it spreads around. Now here, I've drawn you up a quick little map of the premises. You're going to need this, as all your lessons will be everywhere but here.
He passed the parchment to Tisila and then gestured around the room.
This, my newest pupil, is the rogue classroom. When I'm not handling selections, I'm here. Or I'm on an assignment, in which case you can talk to Persh about whatever you need.
He folded his arms.
We meet here every morning as Terrace Crests, usually around 6, but that changes. Get used to waking to the suns,
Tisila nodded, looking around the room. It was enormous. An entire wall was dedicated to locks, padlocks, door locks, safes, and all sorts of other locks and keyholes that Tisila had never seen before. An intricate arrangement of lanterns and mannequins filled an entire corner. And the corner Talahai had occupied showed a number of throwing targets, and archery ones. Small arrows still bristled from the wooden bullseye. Another section of the room, a much smaller one, seemed to be dedicated to alchemy. Vials and mixing jars, pots and chemicals could be seen glistening in the lantern light. What will I be doing? Tisila asked, looking around the room.
All of it.
Maxwell smiled as Tisila turned to him.
As a professional mercenary, you're going to learn to handle it all. Thieving, stealth, espionage, even assassination. We get called upon to do it all.
Tisila looked back at the alchemy table once more. To kill someone for money, with poison. She felt only uncertain. It wasn't a thing she'd really considered before. To defend herself, she would spill blood, but to take a life because she was paid to?
To take a life, someone else's life was to take your own.
Her pause of discomfort must have been noticed. As she turned back to Maxwell, he nodded.
Murder isn't an easy thing to swallow. Don't worry so much about it. I'm hardly likely to ask you to kill a man.
He gestured for Tisila to follow as he headed back to the stairs. She didn't follow, not immediately. The reality of where she was, of who she was signing up to become, was settling in. Mercenaries didn't just fight monsters, and she knew that. And however, not all monsters were creatures of the dark corners of the world, and she knew that, too. People could be worse to people than any beast or creature, and it was true enough that some people were better dead than alive in this world. But do I have the courage to do it? Would I? She shook her head, uncertainty dwelling like a resting snake in the pit of her mind. She looked up at Maxwell, who was patiently waiting for her. Sorry, she muttered, suddenly very aware of how long she had been silent. Maxwell gestured up the stairs and led the way up and back to the corridors. He turned right, sharply, and Tisila followed him into a decorated hallway that was easily 20 feet across. Banners and paintings spread across the stone walls every few feet. Some depicted battles, or beautiful landscapes, or wonderful visions of magic, but all of them were done with skilled hands. Clearly, not all were done by the same person, but Tisila couldn't help but marvel at the value these works likely held. Maxwell suddenly stopped, looking at another simple door, albeit this one was painted black.
These are the rogue quarters. Chose a bunk, get your things squared away. Your roommates are also rogue trainees, and they'll likely be back by the end of the day once they finish their assignments.
Maxwell turned the knob on the door, pushing it open.
Are the Chinese?
Tisila was surprised.
I thought...
You were the only one? Or that it was just you until I?
Maxwell smiled, a small, gentle one.
Now go. It is rare that the rogue recruits spend much time at all in the classroom. The only way to get better at our trade is to practice against people who genuinely don't expect it. Your classmates are out in the town of Ferrum, likely causing havoc, discreetly, and you'll join them soon enough. Besides, Tell is a full mercenary, on her own team and all. She just likes to loiter and see who the new meat is.
He winked, and gestured to the door. Tisila swallowed. The town? The idea was absurd, at best. I'm to go into the town and steal under orders? She blinked as she stepped into the room, her eyes peering into the dark and noticing a dozen small beds lining the walls. Each had a small curtain for privacy, and each had a sizable trunk at the foot of the beds. Some trunks were clearly tampered with, intricate locks and bars and traps clearly attached, and some already defeated.
Might want to keep your valued belongings on your person.
Maxwell sighed a little tiredly.
It's genuinely against the rules to steal from other students, but rules make the best tests for rogues. If things turn up missing, we'll do our best to replace them.
Tisila turned, her eyebrows raised. Students steal from other students?
Well, we are teaching them how. It's usually in good fun. Anyhow, there's a washroom in the back, and you can take your meals in the mess hall when you're hungry. I do expect to see you in the classroom at dawn. You'll meet the others, and we'll see what you can do.
Maxwell ushered her further into the room before stepping out of it.
Make sure you keep yourself clean, by the way. Nobody wants to sleep with a smelly roommate.
The door shut, and Tisila found herself alone in the empty dormitory. She suddenly whipped around, her sharp eyes glaring over every nook and cranny, thoroughly inspecting the room to ensure she was, in fact, alone. Her suspicions alleviated, she relaxed her shoulders before walking to a bed that had a neatly tucked-in sheet and an open, empty trunk. She slumped herself down into it, letting her new rucksack thud into the trunk, and kicked the lid closed. As the day of tension made themselves known in the small of her back and her shoulders, she rolled her neck, grimacing at the dirty feel of her hair. She really was filthy. That was her last thought of the day, before the countless hours of paranoid restlessness and travel on the road caught up with her, and Tisila's mind slipped into unconsciousness.